I don't think there's anything more distressing as a parent than having a sick child. In this interview, Athena and David talk about their daughter and how she had to be rushed to the ICU for a serious illness. It's a pretty distressing story, but I tell you, as we know, God steps in and performs a wonderful miracle. Enjoy.
Thank you, Ben. Welcome to the Revival on the Air Today podcast. My name's David, and I have the pleasure of recording in my own home again in Adelaide. Got a very special guest today I'd like to welcome to the podcast. One of my favourite people in the whole world. Well, actually, she's not my guest because she lives here, and she's not one of my favourite people in the whole world. She is my favourite person in the whole world. It's my wife, Athena. Athena, welcome finally to the Revival on the Air Today podcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for making the time.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Athena, I've been wanting to get you on this podcast for a long time because I wanted to talk about something that happened a very long time ago, early in our marriage. And we've been married almost 25 years next month.
Correct. I'm glad you remembered.
How could I forget? You remind me every day. But I wanted to talk about something that happened a long time ago. But before we go there, I thought it would be nice just to hear a little bit about how you came to know the Lord in the first place, because you and I had very different upbringings.
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Adelaide. I grew up in a big, loud Greek family, and we were part of a very big Greek community here. Part of that was going to the Greek Orthodox Church, which never really gelled with me, even as a young kid. But I think because of that experience, I didn't really want anything to do with religion as I knew it, but I did always believe in God. But just to cut a very long story short, I ended up moving out of home in my early 20s. By that time, I was just a party girl who loved to take drugs, and I was smoking, I was drinking. I was, just living a very worldly lifestyle. And I ended up living in Sydney in the early 90s, and my drug taking kind of expanded there. I had access to a lot more, and I had no one to be accountable to. So I just lived a very, very, I guess, a rock and roll lifestyle, you might say. And I think I got to a point in my mid-20s when I just realised, one day I just had this epiphany, and I realised that it was all a vanity and there just had to be more to life, but I didn't know where to find that more. So I started searching, and about 18 months later, that whole 18 months, I might add, was a very dark time in my life. I really felt like there was no hope for me. I felt like I had no future. I felt like I was 27 or whatever I was at the time, and I felt like I'd lived the best years of my life. So, where was it going to go from there? All downhill, I guess. And very, very dark time. And I really searched, and I didn't even know where to start looking. I certainly wasn't thinking that I needed to be a Christian. But God had other plans, thankfully. It was June 1995. I started a new job. I met a lady there who was part of the Revival Fellowship, and she shared the wonderful gospel with me. And within about 6 or 7 weeks, I went to a meeting. I got baptized. God filled me with the Holy Spirit. I spoke in tongues in the baptism tank, and my life completely and profoundly changed. And here I am 29 years later.
How did your life change?
My thinking changed. I came out of that baptism tank, and it really was, everyone talks, it's a bit of a cliche when you talk about I saw the light, but I had been in such a dark place for, 18 months or so, and suddenly I just felt like my eyes opened up and I was looking into the light, and I felt that there was light in my soul, and I felt everything was different, inside out. It was all different. Lots of things changed.
So how many years ago was that?
29 years ago.
Wow. I like the way that you casually just understated, I had a loud family. I've met your family. I wouldn't have used those terms when I first met your family.
What would you have used?
Well, it was a very different upbringing to mine. Just like so many people have commented on the movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, my family were very quiet. We were big. We had 8 of us in the family. It was a lot quieter.
You must have been missing something, though, because you were attracted to me.
Yeah, the missing piece. It certainly changed my life. All right, so we were married, and we still are married. We got married 1999.
What was the date?
13th of November.
Mm.
It was a Saturday, Carrick Hill. Been a pretty amazing time, 25 years. But I want to talk about something specific about when our children were young. We've got 3 children. And specifically, I want to talk about our second child, Madeline, who was born in 2002. And from what I remember, it was the first time that something really big had happened in our family in regards to big and bad when Madeline became unwell. But the most amazing testimony. So what do you remember about Saturday, 28th of September, 2002?
I remember it was a pretty miserable day because Hannah had just turned 2. That was our oldest. And we were going to have a little birthday party for her. So we were all kind of busy getting that organised, waiting for people to come. And I remember not being so focused on Maddie because I was distracted, other than to feed her and give her a cuddle or check her nappy or something.
Yeah, so it was a pretty cold day. I remember there was a big hailstorm that came through during the day. And we had a little party, and it was actually grand final day, AFL grand final day. So a few people stayed back after the party. We watched the football. So it was pretty late by the time we finished and packed up. But I remember Maddie was only young, 4 months?
4 months, yeah.
And I remember carrying her around a lot during the day, and she was just like a sack of potatoes. I know she was only young, but she was just kind of not, you could sense she's not in a good mood.
Mm.
So afterwards?
Like you said, when everyone left and it was quiet again, I remember picking her up to give her a good night, evening feed. And I felt the same. I felt that she wasn't quite right. And I couldn't put my finger on it. I just knew, kind of like that mother's instinct that, yeah, she's not herself. There's something wrong. But I probably didn't delve too much into it. I had been sick myself probably a week prior to that. I had actually been in bed for about 3 days with what was probably a really bad flu or something. But yeah, I hadn't made any connections. I just remember thinking she doesn't look herself.
So by the time we got her into bed, do you remember what that was like when we put her down to bed?
Not really. I do remember thinking, look, she probably just needs to go to bed early because, yeah, she wasn't quite well. So I put her into bed. I tucked her into her cot, and I think we ended up, in bed going to bed about an hour and a half later. And because we sleep with all the doors open, Madeline's at the other end of the house, but it's not a big house, so you can hear. I remember once we settled, it might have been about 9:30 by this time, 10 o'clock, I could hear a whimpering, I felt at the time, I thought, was that a puppy? Like it just sounded like a little puppy that was just whimpering. And I realised it was Madeline, so I got up.
She hadn't really gone to sleep, had she?
Well, no, probably not. No. But,
she was kind of restless and whimpering. And
yeah, it probably.
Which was unusual in itself, like for her to do that for an hour and a half, 2 hours.
That's right, because she was a good sleeper.
As kind of novice parents.
Oh, I wasn't a novice. I don't know what you thought about yourself.
Well, she was our second child.
Yeah.
But a lot of it, like a lot of people, it's on-the-job training. There's a lot of things you don't know until you actually experience it. And we hadn't experienced anything like this with our first child, Hannah.
No, that's right. She was very healthy and slept well, ate well. But I do recall once I realised that whimpering was coming from Madeline, I remember saying to you, look, I'm going to go and get her and let her sleep in our room tonight because I don't think she's well.
And do you remember what I said?
I probably ignored it, so no, I don't remember.
I remember we were trying to, we'd heard about controlled crying when we're putting kids to bed.
Yes, that's right.
And, okay, if they're not settling, you might just go in and give them kind of a pat or rub and leave again and just let them cry themselves to sleep. And you wanted to bring her into our room and sleep in our bed. And I said, no, just let her go. Leave her in her room. She'll fall asleep.
And thankfully, I ignored you because I got up and I ignored you because I got up, picked her up, and there wasn't a lot of light in the house.
No, it was dark. It was late.
But I remember picking her up out of her cot, and I could actually see that she was very, very pale. Like she was, significantly paler than when I had actually put her to bed a couple of hours before that. So I remember bringing her into the bedroom, and I just turned on the light and I said, look, she looks really white. Like she doesn't look well.
Well, even before you turned on the light, I remember you putting her on the bed.
Mm.
And, we've got a queen-size bed, and I was half asleep, but I could feel the bed moving when she was trying to breathe. And that was before I'd seen her. I thought, this is not a whimpering. This is
No.
something else.
Yeah.
So then you turn the light on.
Yeah. And I remember we both looked at her and I think we just saw the colour.
For me, it wasn't the colour. For me, it was I could see the way that she was breathing, that she wasn't just breathing with her lungs or her chest. She was using every muscle in her body to try and suck in some air.
Mm.
And that was making her body shake.
Mm.
It was a whole body experience for her trying to breathe.
Trying to breathe, correct.
And it was very different to when we'd put her to bed, only a couple of hours earlier.
Yeah, that's right. So she had clearly deteriorated. And I think we discussed it at the time. You were working at Noarlunga Emergency Department as a nurse, and
I should say, as a mental health nurse.
As a mental health nurse.
So I didn't have any pediatric experience, didn't have a lot of medical experience, but I could kind of see there was something wrong. And that was kind of the limit to it.
That's right. And then we just made the decision to take her to Noarlunga and hoping that you would know somebody on shift that night who could look at her pretty quickly.
Well,
so that's what you did.
Yeah. So I think by that time it was getting late. It was probably 10 o'clock. And I remember saying to you, just give them a ring. I knew that the mental health nurse working that night, I said, just give Di a call, ask her to let the triage know we're coming down, and I thought I'll just go and see the doctor, get her checked out.
Mm.
But it's about a 12-minute drive from our house to Noarlunga. And I remember her just whimpering in the car. I had a Leyland P76 V8 engine. I could hear her over the top of that. My car made a lot of noise.
Yeah, that's right. I don't recall ringing the hospital. I just started praying. Like, you put her in the car and took off, and I remember just praying. I wasn't overly worried yet because I didn't know what was wrong or how bad it was, but I was certainly worried enough that, I knew she wasn't well, and so I was just praying and just waiting to hear from you.
So I remember getting down to the hospital, and my colleague Di met me at the door. She was at the triage. Now, Di has a background in mental health nursing, but also worked in pediatrics. So she met me with the triage nurse, and I didn't realise it at the time, but Di took one look at her and thought, this baby's really sick. She asked me to pass Maddie to the triage nurse. They took a few basic details from me, and we walked inside into the department. We went straight. It was back in the old days when you didn't have to wait. It was quiet. And we walked straight into a room. They called the doctor across. The doctor came in straight away. I knew all the team working. And then Di said to me, how about we just leave Maddie here and let's go in the staff room, we'll grab a cup of tea. Now, I didn't think much of it at the time, but Di just kind of whisked me away for the reason of, actually, the doctors need to do something here. This is quite urgent. So I was oblivious to all that. I just thought, I know the doctors, I know the nurses, I'll just leave them there. Let's just go and have a cup of tea and I'll catch up with Di because I don't see her much.
Okay, that's interesting. I'd never heard that before.
So afterwards, we had grabbed our cup of tea and we had a bit of a chat. Sometime later, I ended up back in the room and the doctor said to me, David, we need to send Maddie down to Flinders. She's not well. She'll need to be admitted. So I thought, okay. It's a bit of a blur after that. I remember I must have called you.
Yeah, I did get a call from you like early AM, remember? But, you
after midnight.
Yeah, it was after midnight, but you told me what had happened, that they recommended she go to Flinders. They were going to put her in an ambulance to do that, and you would follow them down.
Yeah.
And call me a bit later.
Yeah, I do remember driving behind the ambulance. They were going pretty fast, and I was too, trying to keep up with them, heading down to Flinders. So they drove up to the front door. I drove to the car park, so I was a few minutes just getting to the department. And I remember walking into the department. I still remember the room and seeing Maddie sitting on the bed by herself, all sort of cushioned up with pillows so that she was sitting upright, and just seeing her trying to take a breath. And I do remember at Noarlunga, they had given her Ventolin and other things in a nebulizer with a little mask. They'd put her on oxygen. And at Flinders, they were doing the same, giving her nebulizers and oxygen just to open up the airways. And it was, I can't remember exactly, but within an hour or two, we were up in the pediatric ward.
I do recall, I think it was about 4:30 a.m. You rang again and told me that they admitted her. You probably went through all of those details. I don't recall. I was just kind of anxious to get to the hospital by that stage. So we decided we'd swap. You'd come home and stay with Hannah and I would go into the hospital. So,
What time was that you went?
well, I think I remember getting there at about 5 a.m. So we just did a
Yeah, I was thinking it was
swap.
about 5 or 6
Yeah.
by the time I got home.
So it was still dark when I got there, and so
And that was in the paediatric ward at the time?
that's right.
The first
And I remember.
So what happened?
Well, they had a little kind of bed set up next to her, and they were just saying, "Oh, that's for you to sleep if you want." But I was just really anxious to know what was wrong, and there were a couple of nurses actually. They seemed to be hovering over her, not just kind of coming and going. But I asked, what is the matter? Like, what's the problem? And they kind of casually, or, they didn't sound alarmed, but they just kind of explained that, oh, we think she's got bronchiolitis, but that's okay. We get a lot of that this time of the year after winter, and we see it a lot in old people and very young children. She'll need a couple of days, she might need a day or so of oxygen, but she'll be all right. So it was that kind of tone. So I think that settled me a bit. Like I thought, oh, okay, that's all right. She's going to be okay.
So bronchiolitis, I know Ben will probably put a link to a web page somewhere. Bronchiolitis is fairly common in kids. A lot of people would know bronchitis. So bronchitis in adults, it's an inflammation of some of the airway. But in adults, it often happens in the big airways, in the big tubes in your lung, whereas that's the bronchi, but the bronchioli, if that's how I say it properly, are the small tubes at the end of the airway. And so it's usually a virus infection, and the ends of the airway where the oxygen exchange happens becomes inflamed. And so it's really hard to get that oxygen transfer from the lungs into the blood. So it becomes a lot higher risk for little kids.
Yeah.
And Matta was only 4 months old.
She was only 4 months old, but she was actually little. Like, she was the smallest of our 3 babies born, and she was still little. She was a little bundle, even at 4 months. Quite chubby, very cute, but very little. So I do remember looking at the monitors and things that the nurses use, and I do remember seeing something about the oxygen being at about 70, 72 or something. I didn't quite know what that meant, but I remember thinking, that sounds a bit low, like you'd want your oxygen to be high. So, yeah, that was just
yes, that would have been the reason why the nurses were hovering, because even though on the one hand they're saying, oh, it's just a virus, she'll be in hospital for a few days, she'll be on oxygen, 70s are low numbers in oxygen saturations. So you and I talking now, would be in the high 90s. That would be normal. Low 90s is kind of okay in an adult, but as it gets lower, it becomes more dangerous. And for a baby, as from my understanding, 70s would be enough to kill you. Your oxygen level is so low. Yeah.
Well, I didn't quite understand all that at that point. It was because the nurses, I felt that they had reassured me that, it was okay. It was all right. So I wasn't panicked. I mean, I was,
But they probably were.
I was worried for Maddie, but I wasn't panicked at that stage. Like, I probably snatched half an hour's sleep and then woke up again and then maybe another half hour. But after that, it was probably about 9 a.m. in the morning, and the doctor came. The doctor, he had a team with him. There were some younger students following him around. But, yeah, I remember he kind of there. I think there were other children in the ward, maybe one other. I can't remember. But anyway, I do recall the doctor coming to see her at about 9 a.m.
So what did the doctor say?
Well, he examined her, and I was kind of in the background because all the students had to mill around the bed. And then he turned to me and he came towards me and he said, you need to start worrying. That really threw me. I thought, oh, what does that mean? And he kind of looked at me in the eyes and he said, you really need to start worrying. She's extremely sick. And that just floored me, because I was just going by what the nurses had told me, that, oh, it's all right. She'll just need oxygen for a day or two. She'll be fine. And suddenly this senior doctor, the pediatrician, was telling me that she was extremely ill and we needed to be very worried for her.
So I'm getting all emotional just thinking about that.
Yeah.
How was that for you?
It
going
floored
from
me.
This reassured nurses reassuring me.
It absolutely floored me. It was such a shock to hear that. And for him to kind of be looking at me intently in the eyes, like saying, you really need to start worrying about her. Because I hadn't been, I knew she was unwell. I didn't want her to be unwell, but there wasn't that panic, like I said. But yeah, that just absolutely floored me.
So what happened?
Well, he went on to explain that she had this virus, and he said this virus gets very bad between day 3 and 6. And I had realised that Madeline, so it was Sunday morning by this stage, and I probably realised then that kind of Friday night and into Saturday, she hadn't fed very well. Again, I had been distracted, but when I looked back, I thought, yeah, she hasn't really fed very well the last day and a half or whatever. And so I explained that to him. He'd asked me some questions, and then he, sort of said that this virus gets really bad between day 3 and 6, and then they start to recover. She was only on day 2 and she was very, very sick. He told me that the first thing they needed to do was get a drip in because she hadn't been feeding very well, and they had tried doing that at the bed, but they couldn't find a vein in her arms or her wrists. So
her slightly chubby.
Yeah, she was a bit
and
chubby, and he said, look, I'm going to take her down the corridor because we've got to get a drip in through her temple vein. And he said, you don't want to watch that. And I thought, correct, I really don't want to watch that. I think some of the medical students were, I can't recall. I just remember I was still in a bit of a state of shock. And I remember him saying that because she was so ill and it was only day 2, that he had to put her in intensive care. So he was going to move her to the neonatal unit. And I think it was on the same floor, and she needed immediate and intensive care.
So they took her away and tried to put this thing in her head.
Yeah. And
do you remember that?
What I remember was, and this kind of freaked me out even more, because what I remember was I could hear her screaming.
Mm.
She was down the corridor. She was 3 rooms away, and I could actually hear her screaming. And I thought, this baby hasn't got enough oxygen to breathe properly, but she's screaming. So that really distressed me. I just remember falling in a heap in the chair, and I was sobbing. I was just absolutely sobbing. I was so distressed. I hadn't expected that news. I could hear her screaming, and I was so distressed. I don't think I had felt distressed like that ever, really, because it was like
It's something that's completely out of my control.
Correct. Nothing I could do at that point.
So there would have been some time, this was days before mobile phone. So at some point you rang me.
Yes.
And I think I called your mum and asked her to look after Hannah.
Yes.
And I would come into the hospital.
That's
right.
right.
But that was going to be an hour or a couple of hours before I could get there.
Yeah. I think I was definitely sobbing and crying. And I remember after talking to you, it was a Sunday. So I thought, well, there's communion meetings are on today. So I rang the first person I could think of and whose number I could remember off by heart. And that was a sister, Marianne. And I rang her and I just explained that Madeline was very sick. She was in intensive care. And could she please put her on the prayer list that day? I do remember trying to get the story out between sobs. And I remember Marianne saying, look, just hang up so we can pray for you too, because, you're clearly distressed. And so I hung up and I sat in the chair and I was really sobbing from and probably loud as I want to be, but yeah, just feeling so distressed.
And then Marianne prayed for you?
She did. And I knew that because this is actually the first amazing miracle of that whole situation, because as I sat there sobbing, was probably only a minute after I'd hung up the phone, and I was heaving, I was just so upset and so distressed. I was kind of heaving and crying, and it was a minute. I didn't time it, but it was very shortly after I hung up the phone, sitting in this chair in this empty room crying, and I just felt this amazing peace come over me. It was I felt like somebody just put a warm blanket around me and just wrapped me in this warm blanket. And immediately, I was kind of mid-sob. So I was had taken this big breath in because I was sobbing, and then a smile came over my face. It was just incredible. And I remember thinking, if anyone's watching me, I look really strange at this point because I've gone from really sobbing to just this amazing peace, and this smile came over, this smile was on my face. And all I could think of was, wow, this is what that scripture means when it says, there's a peace that passes understanding. And I felt that. And I had been in the Lord about 7 years by that stage. And that was the first time I felt that amazing, inexplicable peace that you couldn't even explain to people just how you were feeling inside. So that was the first miracle.
So sometime after that, I joined you up in the intensive care.
That's right.
And I remember Maddie being in the side room because she had a viral infection. They'd put her in that little room on the side. And she had a nurse there. And I remember her having 2 different types of oxygen on her face. One was up through her nose and then the mask over the top. And she was still struggling to breathe.
Yeah.
And that was a long afternoon.
Yeah, it was. It was a bit of a blur at that point because maybe I was just sleep deprived too, because I don't think either of us had slept. But I do remember that I still have a visual memory of her being in this big bed in this glassed-in room with a nurse, and I just remember tubes everywhere, the mask on her face and tubes everywhere, and you could barely see her little face, because she was such a little thing, and she had this big mask on, and but I still had that peace. And I remember thinking, and this is why I guess it's a peace that passes understanding, because if I remember thinking, it's okay, whether she lives or dies, God's in charge.
Were you actually thinking that about whether she lives or dies?
Yeah, I was. I just remember thinking, whether she lives or dies, God's in charge. And I had a peace about that. So I tried to explain that to my mum, and she just couldn't understand that at all. But that was just the peace that I had, that God was in charge. And all of it was in his hands, So I remember that afternoon knowing that there were hundreds of saints praying, so that was really comforting. And then I remember a couple of sisters came probably after the communion meeting. They ducked down to the hospital, and I remember going into the waiting room and having more prayer with them, so that was really good. And then the day just dragged on, didn't it? Like we were just there all day.
I think some family came in to visit, but they weren't allowed to stay because Maddie had a virus.
Yeah.
But at some point it got to the night time and the nurse convinced us to go home.
That's right. I think it was midnight because I had been...
it was midnight by the time we got home, but...
Yeah, because I remember I was trying to organise where we could sleep. I remember talking to a nurse saying, they weren't going to let us sleep in the room, but I thought, there must be some side rooms or something they accommodate parents in neonatal, but I think there were, but they were all full. So, she kind of convinced us that, look, you can't stay. There's nowhere to stay. Why don't you just go home, have some sleep, and come back as soon as you wake up?
Sleep in your own bed. We only lived 12-minute drive away.
Yeah, we're not far.
And so sleep in your own bed and come back in the morning.
Correct.
So we went home, and I remember having a conversation at home. Do you remember that?
No, I was probably dead tired by then.
We had some prayer that night.
Yeah, I remember lots of prayer.
Yeah, so we got home, and before we went to bed, because it was late, we said, let's just have some prayer. And you said, because we knew that the doctors had said this was day 2, going day 3, and yet it will get worse the next few days. And then around about day 6 or 7, they were hoping that they'd move her out of intensive care back to the ward.
Yep.
And she could have 2 weeks in hospital in total. And because it was so early in that progression of the illness, we were expecting several days more. And I remember you saying, let's have some prayer so that Maddie comes out of hospital soon. And I thought, I don't want Maddie to have a slightly shorter progression of her illness. I want her to be healed. So I said, no, let's have some prayer that she gets healed tonight. So we had some prayer and went to bed.
Yeah. And then I think we woke up at about 6:30. And the first thing I did was, I think we had a phone, not a landline by our bed. But as soon as I woke up, I dialed and asked to be put through to the nurse that was with Maddie overnight. And, I remember this. I just, I said, look, we just want to know how Maddie is. We're going to be there very shortly. And she said, it's amazing. She said she's had 2 bottles of breast milk that I had expressed. She said she's had 2 bottles to drink and she's sitting here giggling at me.
And she was off the oxygen.
I don't remember that.
Yeah, she said she's had 2 bottles of milk. She's off the oxygen and she's sitting here
giggling at me. And
she hadn't had 2 bottles of milk in sort of 3 days. She'd hardly eaten anything.
Yeah, that's right. It was just amazing. It was like
Do you remember going into the hospital then?
I do remember arriving there and looking in, because it was a glassed-in room. So when we kind of made it into the neonatal ward, I could see that she had no tubes in her anymore. Like, I just remember her, the day before you could barely see her body, and there she was, this cute little bundle on the bed, and she was happy. She had been fed. It was amazing. It was fantastic. God was in charge, and
how did it feel?
I mean, it was fantastic. And I think I just looked at her and thought God chose that she would live. So obviously I was exceedingly happy about that. I guess, I don't know. I can't remember. I just remember it was almost because we had had that prayer and said no, and because I'd had that feeling, that peace that came over me, at that stage it was like, well, yeah, this is God's plan. Thank you, Lord. We've got our baby.
So what happened next? That was Monday morning?
That was Monday morning. Correct, because it was, so it was Monday morning. So, they gave us a bit of an update. I don't recall. I just wanted to pick her up and cuddle her and kiss her and all of that. And they very quickly moved her into the children's ward back up from when she had come. And look, I don't even recall, the nurses in the neonatal unit or anyone saying anything. I don't recall any conversations I had with them. I probably didn't care because I just knew that Maddie was healed.
But you remember what the nurses said when you got back to the ward?
When I got back to the ward, the doctors had already done their rounds by then, so she wasn't going to get discharged that day. So it was kind of like we were going to spend another night in the ward, in the children's ward. Anyway, so we did that, and I just spent the day, cuddling and kissing her and whatever, whatever we had to do during the day. But
do you remember what the nurses said when you got back to the ward?
Yes, one of them had actually been on the shift the day before, the morning before, when she had been sent to the neonatal unit. And she was actually like, oh my goodness, she said, that is not the same baby that we sent to neonatal yesterday. And I said, that's right. She's not. She's completely healed. She's been healed by the power of God. And I don't recall anything else being said, but I'm sure we had a conversation. But she was actually taken aback. I remember her looking at Maddie and like making that comment, that is not the same baby we sent to neonatal yesterday. I thought, no, it's not, because she's not sick. She's completely healed.
And I remember I must have gone and picked up Hannah by that stage. I remember you telling me you were hassling the nurses.
Well,
get a doctor down here. I want to go home.
No, that was the next morning, because I accepted that we had to stay another night in the children's ward because, by the time they got her up there, it was early afternoon and the doctor had to see her before they discharged her. So I accepted that we had to stay in there one more night. But Tuesday morning, I expected to go home. And so in the morning, I had stayed with Maddie, but in the morning, the nurse that was on duty, she was coming in and out doing her thing. And I just started saying to her, look, what time are the doctors coming? And she said, they come in the morning. They're usually here 9-ish, something like that. Okay, all right. And, patience isn't my strong suit, but...
Really?
I'm better. But anyway, I remember then just being anxious. I wanted to get out of there and I wanted to go home. I wanted to take my healed baby home. So I asked her multiple times. Right? Because it was 9:00 and then it was 9:30 and then it was like 9:45. And every time I saw her, I thought, I'd say to her, look, when are the doctors coming? Are the doctors coming? I want to go home. And she got a bit sick of me after about maybe the 4th or 5th time. And she kind of snapped at me and said, look, she said, I doubt your baby's going to go home today. We don't send babies to intensive care for nothing. And she had this real tone and she was snappy and she said, I doubt you're going to go home. You might think she's okay, but she's been in intensive care and whatever. I just ignored her. Within about half an hour, the doctor came and it was the same pediatrician. He examined her and he just like, wow. And then he looked at me and he said, she's fine, go home. So I would have thought he might have said something else because he was the one who had looked at her, just the day before or a couple of days before on the Sunday and told me how sick she was and that we had to worry about her. But I don't recall him saying anything, like, oh, wow, what happened here? Or, gee, that's amazing. She recovered so quickly. I don't recall him saying anything like that. He just looked at me and he said, she's perfectly fine. Go home. So I probably should have used the opportunity to sit there and witness to him, but I just wanted to get her home. I just wanted to get out of hospital. So that's what we did, and we went home.
I was very interested hearing your perspectives on this. I know we've talked about this a long time, but as a parent, how did it feel to be in a situation where your most precious thing, your most precious possession, your children, are very sick and you've got no control over it?
I have never felt that kind of distress in my life. I don't think ever. That kind of helpless, I can't do anything. I'm worried sick about her. I don't want to lose my baby. It was just, it was a distress I'd never felt before.
How do you think that changed things? Only married a couple of years by that time. We had 2 young children and a third one came later. How do you think that changed things in your walk in the Lord or in your perspective on life or anything?
Feeling that warm blanket and that peace descend and, kind of from the inside out. Felt like a blanket was wrapped around me, but it was that peace that welled up inside me and just understanding that scripture for the first time in my walk. And I already felt really close to God. I already knew, like I believed, I had faith, I loved the Lord. I had seen countless blessings in my life already at that point in my walk. And I was just so grateful and so thankful that he chose to heal Maddie, and it just became one of those amazing miracles that you could share with people.
Yeah, when I look back on it, I think of 2 things. Not only the main thing about Madeline getting healed, where we said, let's have prayer, she will be healed tonight, and she was healed that night. But I also think about the peace that came over both of us, but more to you, because I know you were there at the hospital when you were getting this news and you couldn't contain that news within you. It was just so emotional. And then for Mary Ann to have some prayer and said something like, we will pray for Madeline at the meeting, but hang up the phone now and we will pray for you right now. And you had a miracle that moment.
That's right, because she later confirmed that that's what they did. She had 2 young boys as well. And she said when she hung up, she just got the whole family to get on their knees and they just started praying. So I don't even think the boys wouldn't have been spirit-filled. They were just young children themselves. But she did say they got on their knees, they started praying, and I felt that prayer very quickly.
We've got a remarkable God where
Amen.
God not only looks after us and our emotions and our inadequacies as a parent where we can't control things and fix things. God not only looks after that, looks after the children, looks after the people around us, that we can put things to God and know that He's got it all in hand.
Amen.
Athena, thank you for joining us on the Revival on the Air Today podcast. It's been fantastic to hear your story.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Make me look good.
It can't make you look good. There's no visual here.
Correct. Even better.
Got to make you sound good. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Athena and David, for sharing your wonderful story about what God did for Maddie and for you too as well. If you want to know more about what God can do in your life, how He can change you, how He can heal you from any physical or mental illness, then go to revivalontheairtoday.com or search up in your favourite podcast app. Until next time, God bless.